Did you go to Iraq?
I did not go to Iraq, no. I spent, much of this book, it covers a lot of the 19th century and the 20th century, so it's mostly about digging into the history of where the people who had these ideas came from, and the background of that, but I did travel to some of the more accessible. Missouri, Ohio, the Missouri Mormon Eden sites are actually, they're really interesting. Had a really interesting time there. But I think my other favorite Garden of Eden seeker would have to be the Chinese, where he lived in Hong Kong, but was Chinese, Sei Swantai, who was just completely convinced that the world began in outer Mongolia, and because, of course, that was newly becoming Chinese territory, and everything had to come from China, because China is the Middle Kingdom, and it all spread out from there. And he had these amazing maps with the 4 rivers of Eden all mapped out, and they were gorgeous. And he actually had, talk about people's obsession and people's agenda for why they were even putting all this effort into it. His agenda is probably my favorite, because he was writing in the early part of World War I, and he was also a revolutionary trying to overthrow the last Chinese dynasty. So he was a very political guy, and he was convinced that if he could bring together Chinese culture and Christian culture, he could sort of bring the world together around this. And this was like an unknown sort of empty space that people could build, a new world parliament and sort of bring people together for world peace. And I was like, well, okay, right? I mean, so some of these guys have really interesting motivations, and that was my favorite part of sort of figuring it all out, lining up the dots, and why is this? Why Mongolia? Why Ohio? So those are some of my favorites. Other questions? Yes.
To what extent did you take Talmudic and Kabbalistic writings and analysis into account?
Not very highly. It's interesting that you ask this, because my quest was to understand people who took the Garden of Eden, who believed they were taking the Garden of Eden very literally, right? That they could put this place that I think many of us think of in a more spiritual sense, in a more symbolic sense, they could bring it down to earth, right? That was their goal.
Right.
And in much of the Jewish tradition, it's just not. Garden of Eden is not particularly thought about.
It's the opposite of that.
It's even the opposite. So, yeah, it's interesting.
What do you mean it's the opposite?
It's not looked at as a physical. The perspective is that there are actually 2 gardens of Eden, one on earth and one in heaven, and that they meet, but there isn't a physical place on planet Earth.
I see.
Yeah, which is, I'm really curious about this section, because
It's a concept
yeah.
versus a physical place.
Do you think the concept that you're talking about ties into the idea of tikkun olam at all? Do people talk about those things in the same breath? I only know this over here.
No, they don't.
No. All right, never mind. Thank you. Yes?
Do any of these seekers have any self-awareness about why they're seeking?
I mean,
and must it be on Earth?
Yeah.
So it must be, right, so that's, to me, very interesting. If they're looking for a union of the divine and the mundane in physicality. And
It's very interesting.
And that the tree could die doesn't make any sense to me, but that's...
Yeah. Well, or would the tree have to be dead?
Perfect sense.
I only have one quibble.
That's what, and a lot of these, they read previous theories of the internet, well, that's all well and good, but he didn't take into account, the tree couldn't be dead. And then it would sort of spin off in its own direction. But I don't know about self-awareness in the way that we, looking back on it, would have, but these guys were really promoters, and they, everybody left a record of their idea. People gave speeches, people wrote books, there were newspaper articles about these, there was a paper trail that I could find, so people were definitely out there. And there were times sort of from the 1880s to 1920s that there were multiple competing theories, wildly different competing theories that were out at the same time in the public sphere. So, I think people must have had a little bit of a sense of cynicism. Even there are some great 19th century New York Times articles like, somebody's found the Garden of Eden again. There's now over 100 locations. And, here is a list of all of them. So
Was it a response to Darwin and Wallace?
I think so. I mean, I think that the Garden of Eden search got going again after Darwin. Like it reinvigorated the search because.
We'll show them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's that. There's the will show them. It has to be under. But there's also this sort of like you're saying earlier. There's this need to bring the divine and the everyday together to say that we can still fit. We can sort of still fit the divine in there.
There is at least one place on earth where what I need to be is, where
Right.
there's perfectibility.
Yeah.
Other than Wesleyan, of course.
I really should have created a Wesleyan in the line of that summer camp. I got that. I was so happy. I was like, that's fantastic. The guy just like nailed it. Yes.
There's probably not aware of this, but there's a unintentional irony of having this talk here. This neighborhood, this intersection, 100, 200 feet up the street in Lafayette, used to be known as 5 Points.
Mm-hmm.
You ever saw the movie Gangs of New York?
Mm-hmm.
That took place here. The reason it was called 5 Points, it was conversions of rivers, 5 neighborhoods, which were deemed the 5 worst, most thuggish neighborhoods in New York, and this was basically hell on earth. It's true.
Wow.
That is true. Read about the history of New York City.
Yeah. Yes, Emily.
I was wondering if you could talk about what it's like to write about a place that you haven't been versus a place you have been, that you were able to go and do the research yourself.
It's a really interesting question because
Can you repeat the question?
yes. What's it like to write about a place that you've been to versus a place that you haven't been to, like Iraq? And so I put this book is mostly in the third person, actually, the part that I read that's in the first person, and then once it gets to sort of the late 80s and I can sort of go and talk to people, I sort of put myself in the story, and I visited the Mormon Garden of Eden and also the Creation Museum, which is a whole kettle of fish unto itself. But also, while I was in Ohio, near the Creation Museum, which is in Kentucky, I went to the Serpent Mound State Park in Ohio, which there's a chapter very early on in the book about a German Baptist preacher in 1901 who insisted that this giant Native American mound in the earthwork in the shape of a snake was God's mark of the Garden of Eden, and this was a big giant warning to us never to sin again, and everybody should repent, right? So I went there, and I found a great librarian and local historian who took me to the places that this preacher would have known about, and sort of took me to his home, and got a sense for how close everything was, like his church and the Serpent Mound and the archive. That stuff was really useful to me, and I put that back into the description of his world, but I couldn't put myself in there, And it was nagging me because I had these great conversations with him about, like, he was an ultra Christian conservative, and I was trying to explain to him how there were many interpretations. So we had all these great conversations, but that couldn't go in the book, and it just killed me, right? Whereas with the later chapters, like with the Mormons, I could put myself in there because I am part of that story. So I was really glad I went, and I think it did help me bring 1901, a little bit to life, but I kind of wanted to be there, once
I don't understand why you couldn't put yourself in that.
There's not a rule that says that you can't. I think that...
What were you thinking that made you hold back from sharing that?
Yeah, I had a lot of debates with myself about this because I couldn't go to every place, and I wanted it to be really focused on the individuals that I was writing about, and my dream was to sort of get inside their heads, and for me to do that, just me as the writer, I felt like I had to just sort of zero in on them and their world and what they thought and build out from there. But it's a really good, I was torn. It's a rare book that is 75% in the third person and 25%. I broke some writing rule there, I'm sure, but yes.
Did you come across any mention of Joshua Tree National Park in California?
Not in terms of the Garden of Eden. there are people who think Santa Clara, California is the Garden of Eden. That's it.
You know, people
Major
Santa
advantages.
Cruz is the
Yeah.
garden. No, I mention it because there are a lot of people who believe that the tree was a Joshua tree, of which there are many, obviously named national park in
Right.
California.
There are a lot of great theories about the tree as well. I mean, along with these vast variety of places, you get a vast variety of tree species. There's grapefruit, sequoia, pomegranate, and then of course the fruit, you know, is a whole vast topic. I recently wrote a piece for the Huffington Post about the search for the fruit in particular, and I thought, well, it's fall, it's apple season. We're going to write about apples, right? And it was hilarious, you know, because that's what everyone thinks.
That's a, if you know Hebrew, that's a bad translation.
There's many theories about what it is and where it came from and how it got into our culture, not just in the words itself, but also in art. There's a lot of visual images of the apple as part of the Garden of Eden, but it's certainly never said, and geographically wouldn't make any sense whatsoever if we're talking about southern Mesopotamia.
I think it's widely accepted. I believe it's widely accepted among Hebrew scholars that whatever fruit it was not an apple.
Yeah.
I mean, there are, again, those who believe it's a pomegranate because of the number of seeds, and there are many other theories you referred to, but I think that, you know, in the story, if you believe the story, the fruit was not an apple.
I think that is fair to say. My favorite part of this was I wrote that story and I got 345 comments, people writing in with ideas of the fruit, so it really is fast. Yeah, Wesleyan.
Okay, you mentioned obsession. Now, going through the psychological profiles of these people, did you find anything that was any other common diagnosis of these people? Like, I mean, like either, you know, by doctors or anything that have mentioned like that had kind of gone across the board or anything like that?
That's a really interesting question, because not just psychology, but I kept trying to find unifying factors at all, because the project kept kind of growing.
Or their history or upbringing or anything like that. Or involvement with religion, anything.
There is an involvement with, like, there's a lot of people who left religion, became disillusioned or changed religion or converted at some point. Like the Florida guy with the Noah's Ark thing grew up in a very diehard Baptist congregation and totally threw it away and had to sort of look again. The Uranta book, people who believe that aliens, you know, came thousands of years ago throughout, it was a wonky book. They were disillusioned Jehovah's Witnesses who sort of started a new thing. And then I think, like, I think there's a certain megalomania involved, you know, because when you're saying where the Garden of Eden is, you're saying what the whole world is, right? You're saying, like, this is my view of the world, and I want you to believe it. And, you know, but to sort of stand on the mountaintop and proclaim that requires a certain amount of, perhaps, overconfidence. That's the word.
Anything in their educational background, or?
It'd be really hard to draw a line. I mean, I guess the thing that I would have to say was that most of their religious backgrounds, whether they left them or not, but their original religious backgrounds were mostly Protestant. Not a lot of Catholic seekers, not a lot of Jewish seekers. That's a very, you know, broad generalization.